Welcome to Africarized, your channel for African history, culture and heritage. March 25th is widely recognized as the day Britain officially abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. Every year, this date is commemorated with speeches and ceremonies across the world. But how many people remember that Arab slave traders were both the first and the last in modern history to ship millions of Africans out of the continent as slaves? The truth is that the Arab involvement in slavery stretches back centuries before Europeans entered the picture. The history of anti-black racism in the Arab world predates European racism, with the early Islamic empires exhibiting clear patterns of racial hierarchy and discrimination. For centuries, Africans were subjected to the harshest and most dehumanizing forms of bondage under these systems. By the late 19th century, Europeans were even taking photographs of chained African captives aboard Arab slave ships along the East African coast. While slavery had officially been abolished in much of the Western world, it continued to flourish openly in parts of the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, long after it had ended in the Americas. Even as late as the 1960s, some African Muslims arriving in Mecca for religious pilgrimages would finance their journeys by selling slaves. This was happening a full century after the United States abolished slavery. If you enjoy this video, please remember to like it to motivate us to create more content. Arab nations were among the last in the world to outlaw slavery. Saudi Arabia and Yemen finally abolished it in 1962, the United Arab Emirates in 1963, and Oman as late as 1970. But even today, slavery persists in some places. In Mauritania, for instance, hereditary racial slavery has continued despite repeated government attempts to ban it. Mauritania became the last country on earth to officially abolish slavery in 1981 through a presidential decree, but no legal punishment was put in place for slaveholders. It wasn't until 2007, under heavy international pressure, that Mauritania passed a law allowing slaveholders to be prosecuted. Yet, in reality, this law has rarely been enforced. Shockingly, more anti-slavery activists have been jailed than slave owners. In some cases, former slaveholders even receive compensation for releasing enslaved people, while the victims of their cruelty receive nothing. In 2015, the government went a step further by creating special courts to deal with slavery-related cases. But so far, only a handful of cases have been heard, leaving the practice largely untouched. The cruelty of castration. One of the darkest, most horrific aspects of the Arab slave trade was the systematic castration of male captives. This was done deliberately to prevent enslaved Africans from having children, ensuring that the enslaved population could never grow naturally. In contrast, while slavery in the Americas was brutal and families were often torn apart, enslaved Africans were at least allowed to reproduce. Children born into slavery became the property of their masters, providing a continuous labor force. However, under the Arab system, the very possibility of building families and communities was destroyed. Many young African boys were forcibly castrated, a process that was not only inhumane, but also often fatal. A large percentage of these boys did not survive the operation, and those who did were condemned to a life of suffering and humiliation. This level of cruelty was staggering, stripping these men not only of their freedom, but also of their masculinity and their ability to leave a legacy. The global context of slavery. In his book, Slaves and Slavery, 1998, British writer Duncan Clark defined slavery as the reduction of fellow human beings to the legal status of chattels, allowing them to be bought and sold as goods. Both European and Arab slave traders used this exact logic, reducing millions of Africans to nothing more than property. The origins of this exploitation lie deep in history. Long before the discovery of the Americas, civilizations around the Mediterranean world, Europe and the Middle East, were already taking Africans as slaves. Slavery was a core part of life in ancient societies like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Imperial Rome, and later in Islamic kingdoms of North Africa and the Middle East. Interestingly, before black Africans became the primary victims of slavery, Slavic people from Eastern Europe were the main source of slaves in the medieval period. In fact, the very word slave comes from the term sklavus, meaning Slav. For centuries, war captives from regions like Bosnia were sold in the markets of cities such as Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, and shipped by Venetian traders to the Islamic world. These slaves filled roles as household servants, laborers, and concubines. But around 1000 AD, as the supply of Slavic captives dwindled and Arab conquests across Europe were halted, the focus shifted to Africa. The vast, unprotected regions of sub-Saharan Africa became a new source of human cargo. The scale of the Arab slave trade. The scale of this slave trade was immense, though historians still debate the exact numbers. What is clear, however, is that millions of Africans were captured, sold, and shipped across the Indian Ocean and the Sahara Desert. Captured boys and girls were first taken to Egypt, where they were either sold into slavery locally or transported even further, to India, China, Indonesia, and across the Middle East. By the 10th century, the demand for enslaved Africans had skyrocketed. They were used in a wide range of roles, including plantation laborers, domestic servants, concubines and sex slaves, soldiers and guards, known as slave warriors. It is estimated that during this period, as many as 5,000 Africans were shipped out of the continent each year. This was a centuries-long process that continued largely unchallenged until very recent history. A lasting legacy. The Arab slave trade left deep scars on African societies. Communities were depopulated, families were destroyed, and generations were lost. The castration of African men ensured that there would be no natural growth of African slave populations, forcing Arab traders to continually raid the continent for new captives. This cycle of violence and exploitation helped shape the modern world, influencing migration patterns, cultural dynamics, and even today's political realities. While the transatlantic slave trade is more widely discussed, it is vital to remember and acknowledge this other dark chapter in history. The Arab slave trade was just as brutal, and in some ways, even more devastating, because of its systematic destruction of family lines through castration and its staggering longevity, lasting well into the 20th century. The scale and horror of the Arab slave trade. When we think of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade is often the first image that comes to mind. Ships packed with African captives crossing the ocean to the Americas have become a symbol of human cruelty. Yet, a lesser-known but equally devastating chapter of history is the Arab slave trade, which spanned well over a millennium and claimed millions of African lives. Historian Paul Lovejoy, one of the leading scholars on slavery, estimates that approximately 9.85 million Africans were shipped out as slaves to Arabia and, in smaller numbers, to regions of the Indian subcontinent. His research breaks these figures down across several centuries. Between AD 650 and 1600, Arab traders exported an average of 5,000 Africans per year, totaling roughly 7.25 million people. The trade intensified between 1600 and 1800, during which another 1.4 million Africans were enslaved and transported. The 19th century marked the peak of the Arabian trade, with as many as 12,000 Africans shipped out annually, adding 1.2 million more victims in that century alone. These figures are staggering, but some historians believe the numbers were even higher. Other estimates suggest that between AD 650 and 1900, anywhere from 10 million to 20 million Africans were enslaved by Arab traders. Some researchers go further, arguing that over 20 million enslaved Africans may have been delivered to the Islamic world through the trans-Saharan routes alone. Dr. 𝗀𝗋𝗋𝗄𝒂𝒃, in his groundbreaking 2001 book, The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, provides an even more chilling perspective. He estimates that over 80 million Africans died during the treacherous journeys across the Sahara Desert, never even reaching the slave markets where they were destined to be sold, a trade marked by unrelenting brutality. The Arab slave trade was marked by extreme cruelty and relentless violence. Like the transatlantic slave trade, captives were beaten, shackled, and forced into submission. However, the journeys endured by victims of the sub-Saharan slave routes were uniquely horrific. Instead of being transported by ships across the ocean, these captives were forced to walk for weeks or even months through the scorching deserts, carrying heavy loads for their new masters. They were marched from their homelands in West, Central, or East Africa toward major slave markets in Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Mecca, and other centers of trade. The journey itself was often a death march. Exhaustion, hunger, thirst, and disease claimed countless lives. British explorer Sir Henry Hamilton Johnston, who documented the Arab slave trade in detail, described how thousands perished during these crossings. Those who fell behind were often brutally killed on the spot, left to rot in the desert sands. David Livingstone's heartbreaking account. The world first began to grasp the depth of these atrocities thanks to the writings of explorers and missionaries like David Livingstone, who traveled extensively in Africa during the 19th century. In 1870, he penned a letter describing the horrifying sight he encountered. "In less time than it takes me to speak of it, these unfortunate creatures, 84 in total, trudged into the village where we stood. The oldest among them were women in their early 20s. There were also youths of 18 or 19, but most were boys and girls as young as 7 to 14 years old. It was the most terrible sight I have ever witnessed. To call them emaciated would be an understatement. Each had their neck secured in a heavy forked stick, weighing up to 40 pounds and stretching over 5 or 6 feet long. The women were tied with bark thongs, cruel bindings that grow rigid and unyielding under the sun's heat. The smallest children were fastened to their mothers by these same thongs." Livingstone went on to describe scenes of unimaginable cruelty. Along the route, he was shown the spot where a woman too weak to continue was hacked to death with an axe by her captors. Further along, he came across a newborn baby that had been killed. Too frail to be carried by its exhausted mother, the infant was smashed against a tree and discarded like trash. This level of inhumanity shocked even seasoned travelers, and stands as evidence of how merciless the Arab slave trade truly was. The lasting trauma on African societies. The psychological and cultural damage inflicted by centuries of Arab slave trading is incalculable. Historians emphasize that it is wrong to interpret Africa's historical struggles as mere stagnation or backwardness. Instead, the slave trade was a continuous catastrophe, a relentless assault on African societies that drained them of their people, resources, and stability. Entire communities were destroyed. Generations were lost. The trauma of these events became embedded in what some scholars refer to as the racial memory of the continent. For African women in particular, the scars ran deep, as they endured not only forced labor, but also sexual exploitation in harems and households across the Middle East and beyond. This was more than slavery. It was a form of genocide, as countless Africans were deliberately killed during capture, transit, and forced labor. Why the Arab slave trade was especially deadly. While the transatlantic slave trade was brutal, Arab slave trading routes were often even deadlier. Historian accounts reveal that more Africans died during the desert crossings than during the infamous Middle Passage across the Atlantic. In the Sahara, the journey could last up to 3 grueling months. Slaves were given minimal food and water while enduring blistering heat during the day and freezing cold at night. Many collapsed from exhaustion, only to be abandoned or executed. Those who reached their destinations were often in no condition to work and frequently died soon after arrival. Conditions in certain industries were especially lethal. In the Sahara salt mines, for instance, African slaves typically died within 5 years due to harsh working conditions and exposure to deadly diseases to which they had no immunity. The Arab slave trade also spanned a vast geographical area. In West Africa, it extended from the Niger Valley to the Gulf of Guinea, while in the east, it reached deep into the interior regions of what is now Tanzania, Kenya, and beyond. Eyewitness testimony from Gustav Nachtigall. German explorer Gustav Nachtigall, who traveled across North Africa, recorded the suffering he witnessed firsthand. His chilling words capture the sheer hopelessness of these journeys. The poor children of the Black Country seemed to meet death here at the last stage of a long, hopeless journey. With little food and scarce water, they were forced across the desert under relentless sun and cruel masters. The contrast between their lush homeland and the dry, lifeless desert destroyed their spirits as much as their bodies. Fatigue, hunger, thirst, and constant beatings drained away their last strength. When they could no longer rise and walk, they were simply abandoned, left to die under the scorching sun, their young lives fading into nothingness. Nachtigall's testimony, like that of Livingstone, stands as irrefutable evidence of the horrors endured by millions. A trade that lasted for 1,300 years. One of the most striking differences between the Arab and Atlantic slave trades is their duration. While the transatlantic trade lasted roughly 3 centuries, the Arab slave trade persisted for 13 centuries, beginning centuries before European involvement and continuing well after it had ended in the West. This long timeline meant that the Arab trade extracted a far greater toll on African populations over time. Millions were uprooted, and untold numbers died during capture and transit. It was a slow, grinding process of exploitation that reshaped entire regions and influenced global history. A legacy. We must not forget the Arab slave trade is a painful and often overlooked chapter of world history. Its scale rivals that of the Atlantic slave trade, yet its stories are less frequently told. By understanding this dark history, we gain a fuller picture of the challenges African societies faced and the resilience they demonstrated in surviving centuries of oppression. The voices of explorers, historians, and survivors remind us that behind every statistic was a human life, a stolen future, and a story that deserves to be remembered. The forgotten atrocity, the Arab slave trade and its lasting impact on Africa. The story of slavery in Africa is often told through the lens of the transatlantic slave trade. While the horrors of that era are well documented and memorialized, there exists another chapter of African history, equally brutal but far less discussed, the Arab-Muslim slave trade. This centuries-long system of human exploitation began long before Europeans reached Africa's shores and continued well after the abolition of slavery in the Western world. Historians estimate that the Arab slave trade impacted over 17 million Africans in the Sahara region alone. More than 9 million people were deported from their homelands to foreign lands in the Middle East and beyond, and another 2 million died during forced marches across the desert. These staggering numbers only scratch the surface of the devastation. Entire communities were wiped out, cultures were disrupted, and generations were forever altered by a system built on dehumanization, greed, and violence. Religious justification for slavery. Unlike popular belief that slavery was merely an economic venture, it was also legitimized by religious and cultural doctrines. In many Arab societies, slavery was seen not only as acceptable, but also as sanctioned under religious law. Just as Christianity later provided moral cover for the transatlantic slave trade, Islam was interpreted in certain ways to justify the enslavement of Africans. For instance, the renowned Tunisian historian Ibn Khaldun, 1332–1406, wrote openly about his belief that Africans were naturally suited for servitude. In his writings, he stated, "The only peoples to accept slavery are the Negroes, because of their lower degree of humanity, their place being closer to the animal stage." Similarly, Algerian theologian Ahmed al-Ansharisi, 1430–31–1508, provided legal opinions reinforcing this practice. He argued that even if African slaves converted to Islam after being captured, they were not automatically freed. Their prior state of unbelief was considered justification for permanent servitude. This ensured a continuous cycle where African captives and their descendants could remain enslaved for life, despite any religious transformation they underwent. These views created a framework where slavery was deeply embedded in society, endorsed by powerful religious authorities, and difficult to challenge. The horrors of castration in the Arab slave trade. Among the many atrocities committed during the Arab slave trade, one of the most inhumane practices was the systematic castration of male slaves. This brutal procedure was unique to the Arab system and was not common in the transatlantic trade. While African women and young girls were primarily captured for sexual exploitation and domestic servitude, young boys and men were subjected to castration. The purpose was twofold: to make them non-threatening to their masters, particularly in households with women, and to increase their market value as eunuchs. Eunuchs were considered more trustworthy and less likely to rebel because they could not father children or build families of their own. The castration process was carried out under horrific conditions. It was typically performed on boys between 9 and 12 years old, as it was believed they had a slightly better chance of surviving the procedure than older males. However, survival was far from guaranteed. Historical records suggest that 6 out of every 10 boys died from shock, infection, or blood loss during or shortly after the operation. The survivors faced a lifetime of physical complications. Without natural hormone production, they often suffered from obesity, fatigue, osteoporosis, stunted physical development, and severe emotional trauma. Many were haunted by the pain and loss they endured, living as outcasts, stripped of their identity and family connections. Reasons behind the castration practice. 1. Economic incentives. Castrated male slaves, known as eunuchs, were highly prized in the Arab world. Their inability to reproduce was seen as an advantage, as they could serve in sensitive positions without threatening the wealth or lineage of their owners. Eunuchs were often employed as guards of royal harems, administrative officials, or attendants in the courts of powerful rulers. Because of their high value, eunuchs fetched significantly higher prices in slave markets than non-castrated men. This created strong economic incentives for slavers to continue this gruesome practice. Entire castration centers emerged, such as those in Venice, where young boys were mutilated before being shipped to the Middle East. Historical records show just how deeply entrenched this practice was. At the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, thousands of eunuchs served in administrative and military roles. Even as late as 1903, there were reports of nearly 200 African eunuchs in service to the Ottoman royal family. 2. Control and domination. Castration was also a method of psychological control. By permanently removing a man's reproductive ability, slavers stripped him of his future lineage and sense of identity. This created an enduring power imbalance, ensuring complete subjugation to the master. Masters feared that intact male slaves might form relationships with women in the household, potentially fathering children who could claim inheritance or disrupt the family's power. Castration eliminated this perceived threat entirely. 3. Social disruption and community impact. The widespread capture and castration of young men wreaked havoc on African societies. Villages were left with imbalanced gender ratios, weakening their ability to defend against further raids. Communities became vulnerable to collapse, as their young men were either enslaved or killed during resistance. Entire regions, especially East Africa and Sudan, were systematically depopulated. Families were torn apart, and survivors were forced to live with constant fear of abduction. Some African groups even resorted to preemptively castrating their own boys in a desperate attempt to prevent Arab slavers from taking them. 4. Religious and cultural beliefs. In certain Islamic traditions, eunuchs were considered spiritually purer and thus better suited to guard holy sites. Historical records reveal that African eunuchs were employed as guardians of the Kaaba in Mecca, a practice that persisted for centuries. This spiritual association gave the practice an additional layer of legitimacy, further embedding it into the cultural fabric of Arab society. At the height of its influence, the Khalifa in Baghdad maintained 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs in his palace. Physical and psychological trauma. The castration process inflicted both physical suffering and deep psychological scars. With no anesthesia or sterile techniques, the procedure was agonizing and often fatal. Survivors lived with a constant reminder of their mutilation, facing ridicule and discrimination even within slave communities. The psychological toll was equally severe. Stripped of their manhood, families, and cultural ties, many eunuchs lived in profound isolation. Cut off from their heritage, they were forced to serve foreign masters in distant lands, often for life. The decline of African populations. The Arab slave trade contributed to a dramatic decline in African populations over centuries. European explorer Henry Morton Stanley, 1841 to 1904, described the aftermath of Arab slave raids in stark terms. The black blood flows toward the north. The equator smells corpses. This haunting statement reflected the scale of death and destruction. In some regions, the population never fully recovered, leaving deep scars on the social and economic structures of African societies. Moreover, because most male slaves were castrated and could not reproduce, no significant African diaspora developed in Arab lands, unlike in the Americas. The descendants of those taken simply did not exist, erasing entire bloodlines from history. Global recognition, or lack thereof. While the transatlantic slave trade is commemorated worldwide, the Arab-Muslim slave trade remains largely absent from global discussions. The United Nations recognizes March 25th as the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Similarly, UNESCO observes August 23rd as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition. However, no such day exists to honor the victims of the Arab slave trade. There are no major museums, no international research programs, and few educational initiatives dedicated to documenting this devastating history. This absence raises critical questions. When will the victims of the Arab slave trade receive the same acknowledgement and respect? When will there be efforts to preserve historical sites, create educational materials, and foster public awareness of this dark chapter in African history? When will the world openly confront this legacy, just as it has with the transatlantic trade? A call for awareness and action. The story of the Arab slave trade is not just about the past, it has enduring consequences today. The patterns of exploitation, social disruption, and cultural erasure still shape parts of Africa and its relationship with the world. By bringing this history to light, we honor the memory of millions who suffered and died. Recognition is the first step toward healing and empowerment. Only by confronting the full truth can we build a future rooted in justice and dignity. As we reflect on this painful history, Let us commit to ensuring it is never forgotten. Just as the world remembers other atrocities, the victims of the Arab slave trade deserve their place in collective memory. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Africarized and join our YouTube membership for exclusive content and community perks.